Welcome to Pearced Off. I'm Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and this counter-apologetic segment on the Skepticule Podcast today will feature an argument by a blogger who I've come across and who occasionally guest posts for me, called The Thinker. He has a blog called Atheism and the City, and he's produced quite an interesting argument, which is a counter to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, called the EAAN. So this argument is the evolutionary argument against God, or the EAAG. And as the thinker says, atheists generally tend to not rely on deductive arguments or syllogisms to make their case against God. However, while recently debating a challenge I proposed to theistic evolutionists against the incompatibility of an omnibenevolent creator with evolution, I've come up with a counter-argument to Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, and it's called the evolutionary argument against God, or the EAAG. This argument is predicated on the traditional concept of God, who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, and the notion that God either started the evolutionary process as a means to enable human existence, or that he both started and guided the evolutionary process along some of its steps to ensure humans would evolve. The argument goes as follows. Number one, if God chose to use evolution as a process by which he created human beings and all other forms of life, then God knowingly chose a process that requires suffering. That is logically unnecessary. 2. If humans are the product of gradual evolution guided by God, then at some point during the process the soul appeared. 3. Once the soul appeared, humans could be rewarded in an afterlife for the suffering they endured while they were alive. 4. If higher level primates are capable of third level pain awareness, that is, knowing they are experiencing pain, then our pre-human hominid ancestors also did, and they did not have souls. 5. This means God chose to create humans using a method that knowingly would involve conscious suffering that was not logically necessary. 6. An all-good, perfectly moral God who is incapable of unwarranted cruelty would not create beings that would consciously suffer in a way that was not logically necessary. And therefore 7. The traditional notion of God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good does not exist. So obviously one can go into each of the premises and the conclusion and look at them in detail. I won't do that today, but it is interesting to look at evolution because there are a lot of theistic evolutionists out there. So they believe that God used evolution because the evidence is so indubitable, so huge to support evolution, that really you cannot deny its truth as a scientific fact. So how does a religious person take that on board? Well, they literally have to say evolution and belief in God are compatible. In other words, God has used evolution to arrive at humanity. The problem there is, of course, that evolution uses geography, geology, plate tectonics, together with random mutations. So in order for humanity to arise and God to intend that, he has to micromanage the whole planet in such a meticulous manner. But of course, that's not what this argument is about. This argument is about the fact that humans suffer, and pre-human hominids obviously suffered in this process that brought about humanity, and the suffering of the pre-human hominids who did not have souls means that there was no compensation for their suffering. And of course, I've talked about this in a previous Skepticule podcast, that heaven isn't actually moral justification for suffering, it's merely compensation. So even given heaven and the payment for suffering through eternal life in heaven, that does not morally justify suffering. So that's not even a get out of jail free card for theists. And we have this idea that evolution is a painful process, it's full of suffering, full of death and carnivorousness and all these issues that I've talked about before. And it simply cannot be compatible with the traditional notion of God. So that is what the thinker has done here, and he sets this out in a lot more detail than I have today, but I just wanted to very quickly establish that evolution and theism are not good bedfellows. And there is a movement now with a lot of theists to adopt evolution as a tenet of their belief because the evidence is so strong. But of course, this argument sets out to show that that is not a sound move. And if we want to condense the argument into three shorter deductive points, they would be: one, if God chose to use evolution as a process by which he created human beings and all other forms of life, then God knowingly chose a process that requires suffering that is logically unnecessary. Two, an all-good, perfectly moral God who is incapable of unwarranted cruelty would not create beings that would consciously suffer in a way that was not logically necessary. Therefore, three, the traditional notion of God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good does not exist. Discuss. As ever, drop by my blog, buy all my lovely books, and question everything. I've been Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Thanks for listening.